The U.S. is working overtime under the Biden administration to hem Israel in to strategic defeat in both Gaza and in Lebanon. What's the game the U.S. is playing, and how can Israel extricate itself from the vice grip that the administration has placed it in? I'll have the details and some suggestions coming up on In Focus. All right, 8+ months into this war, we need to be honest with ourselves. What would a victory for Israel look like in Gaza and in Lebanon? Well, in Gaza, actually in both places, it's fairly straightforward, and I'm just going to walk through them one by one. In Gaza, an Israeli victory would look like Israel not only in full control of security within the Gaza Strip, but Israel would be annexing large swaths of Gaza, reinstating Jewish communities in northern Gaza and in southern Gaza, and build and annex a buffer zone between Israel and Gaza that's somewhere between 1 and 3 kilometers wide from east to west. That's what victory would look like. That is Israel in firm control of Gaza permanently, with Israelis back living in Gaza as they were until 2005, when Israel expelled all of its civilians from Gaza and packed up its military forces, including along the international border with Egypt, and went home to such horrific effect as we saw on October 7th and since. So, and even before. So that's what victory in Gaza looks like. Israel in charge of Gaza, Israel sovereign over large swaths of Gaza, and Gaza itself being reduced to a much more minor area, not under the control of Hamas, but under the control, devolved, of local administration of various local leaders in various enclaves in Gaza that Israel does not annex. And the other thing that we would have included in such a thing would be the dispersal of much of the civilian population in Gaza to friendly countries far away from Israel, like Qatar, like Turkey, like Chechnya, and like Spain, frankly, who support Hamas, support its goal of annihilating Israel, but can't actually cause Israel any immediate harm because they don't border Israel. That's what it would look like. As for Lebanon, what would a strategic victory for Israel look like in Lebanon, which is controlled by Iran through Hezbollah? Again, here too, under any sort of scenario that would guarantee Israeli victory, Israel would annex large swaths of southern Lebanon up to at least the Litani River, and it would be reasonable to say perhaps beyond that to the Awali River. These are natural barriers that protect northern Israel from Lebanon. In other words, it wouldn't just be a security zone that Israel would establish inside of Lebanon. Israel would expand its sovereign territory to areas now under Hezbollah Iranian control in South Lebanon, and we would send Israelis to go live there, along with, by the way, the Lebanese that fled to Israel when Israel idiotically left South Lebanon, our security zone there in 2000, on May 31st, 2000. So Israeli victory in both cases involves Israel placing large swaths of Gaza on the one hand and Lebanon on the other hand under Israeli sovereignty. The same, of course, goes with Judea and Samaria. What does strategic victory over the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria look like? Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. That's what it looks like. So we're just going to put it out very simply. Now, why is it that Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't say this? Why didn't he make this Israel's goal after October 7th in Gaza and with an imminent threat to all of the communities along the border with Lebanon in the north? Why didn't he just say this? Well, he can't, because look at the Biden administration. If Israel had said anything even remotely similar to something like this, which, by the way, everybody knows, I mean, you don't have to be a strategic genius to understand that the way to annihilate forces that are bent on your destruction is to take away the things that they value most, which is land. That's what you do. You don't need to, again, you don't need to, get some PhD from whatever fancy schmancy university in order to understand. It's ABC. Israel, we have to remember, we're not an imperial power. We're not a global superpower. We live here. These people live across the street from us, effectively, right? I mean, the border towns in Lebanon, where all of these Iranian-controlled terror forces are perched on the border to invade northern Israel, right? That's like Tijuana to, San Diego. It's even closer. There's no distance. Same, obviously, as we saw on October 7th with Gaza and the communities along the border with Gaza. We live here. So if we want to push them away, we take over their neighborhoods. That's all you do with a bully. You got to take over their turf. You take over their turf by putting your people there, including your, obviously, permanent military bases. So, the Biden administration has overruled even thinking about such an option, right? I mean, they said almost at the outset of the operation of the war in Gaza that they oppose any changes in Gaza's borders, right? That was one of the first things that they said that made clear that they don't want to see Hamas defeated in this war, right? And since then, they've just upped the ante until the point where today, as I'm about to get into, already openly supporting Hamas. I read this article that came out in the Wall Street Journal in December, where they revealed details of an emergency phone call for over a half an hour that President Biden held with Prime Minister Netanyahu on October 11th. And according to the Wall Street Journal write-up of the conversation, what happened was that Israel wanted to preemptively attack Hezbollah. We believed. We saw signs that Hezbollah, like Hamas, was about to invade northern Israel and try to seize, hundreds of hostages back to Lebanon and to massacre thousands, which is certainly within the capacity of Hezbollah to carry out. And Israeli jets were actually, according to the story, in the air, poised to attack Hezbollah, and we wanted to coordinate with the United States so that they would support our efforts. And there was a principals meeting chaired by Jake Sullivan. That you had Avril Haines, you had the head of the director of national intelligence, you had William Burns, CIA director, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, and I think a few others sitting there. And they said, over our dead body, Israel isn't allowed to take any action that would undermine Hezbollah, right? No. And so then Biden got on the phone and said to Prime Minister Netanyahu and his war cabinet, over my dead body, you're not allowed to do anything. We're not going to support such an Israeli action that would scale back the Hezbollah threat to northern Israel. And as a result, as we've seen, we have 60,000 internal refugees of the communities in the north displaced in hotels around Israel. You have all of the local businesses in the areas of the Western Galilee, the Upper Galilee, the Golan Heights. They're all failing because there's no business, because, Israelis aren't going up north, because why would we? We had 200 missiles falling on Israel just on Tuesday during the Shavuot holiday. Today I'm filming on Wednesday that was, and today I'm filming on Thursday. We've had dozens and dozens and dozens of assaults already on Safed, on going down further south. Tiberias absorbed over 20 missiles over the Shavuot holiday on Wednesday. So, we're talking about a massive barrage that goes all the way down to the southern end of the Lake of Galilee. You had Haifa was also directly attacked over the holiday. So, you're seeing a rapid and constant escalation of Hezbollah's attacks against Israel. And from the outset, the United States has put down its foot and deterred Israel from taking any offensive action against Hezbollah. We're allowed to intercept. We're not allowed to degrade. And when Hezbollah's entire military doctrine, as I think Michael Doran pointed out from the Hudson Institute and Tablet magazine a few weeks ago, Hezbollah, Iran, Hamas's strategy, they're all offensive strategies. And the only thing that the United States supports Israel doing is defending itself against them. So they keep learning our defenses, get better at penetrating them, attacking us, right? Last week they claimed that they took down an Iron Dome battery. They've certainly taken out a lot of our air defense and control targets in northern Israel since October 7th that have diminished Israel's control of the skies. Their drone attacks on Israel show that they have Russian-like drone capabilities. Not surprising, because Russia got its drone capabilities from Iran, that have changed completely the Air Force equilibrium inside of northern Israel and into Lebanon and Syria. This is a new situation, a new strategic reality that the Air Force clearly is not capable of completely handling, because otherwise they wouldn't be burning a swath across northern Israel now for several weeks. So that's a situation that we're facing in northern Israel. And again, so we left our security zone in southern Lebanon 24 years ago on May 31st, 2000. And the reality today, in mid-June 2024, is that it is Hezbollah that controls northern Israel, not Israel that controls southern Lebanon, right? Because they forced us from the outset of the war to evacuate our civilian population. And that's just in the first instance, because if we go into an actual major conventional ground war inside of Lebanon to try to take direct action against Hezbollah's army, which is really the Lebanese army, because Hezbollah controls Lebanon, and I don't know what our losses would look like, but they're not going to be at all good. And the hundreds of projectiles that we're seeing now directed against northern Israel would be transformed into thousands of missiles being shot across all of Israel, which are the entire country essentially is within Hezbollah's range. We'll have that added to Iranian missile assaults on Israel like we saw on April 13th and 14th. And what the United States keeps telling us, as it told Israel on April 13th, 14th, when we were attacked by 300 cruise and ballistic missiles and drones from Iran, is take a win in interception. And, if we intercept 90% of 300, that means that 30 get through. If we intercept 90% of 3,000, that means that 300 get through. And that's an enormous number of projectiles that get through, particularly since their payloads are much bigger than they were in the past, particularly since their precision-guided systems are pretty precise, and therefore they're capable of taking out 300 strategic sites, say, on a daily basis for weeks and weeks and weeks. This is the kind of damage that no country can possibly incur. But what the Americans are saying to Israel is, yes, you can only intercept. You're not actually allowed to attack. We see this with the Americans' own actions in the Red Sea, where rather than take down the Houthi regime in Yemen, which is with Iranian control, they are paralyzing global shipping through the Bab el-Mandab at the mouth of the Red Sea, and they have been now for over 8 months. And the United States, instead of taking action against the Houthis and the Iranian naval assets that are directing all of the Houthis' operations, the United States has relegated itself and the British to intercepting missiles that the Houthis are shooting en route to their targets. So that's all America itself will do. It's not taking action against Iran. It's not taking action against any of Iran's proxies. Okay, so that's what America is saying that Israel has to do in Lebanon. It's obviously what it's saying that Israel has to do vis-a-vis Hamas. With regard specifically to Hamas today, we see that most of the international coverage of what's happening in Gaza revolves around the question of a ceasefire for hostages deal that I think earlier this week on Monday, the UN Security Council passed a resolution along the lines of the three-phase ceasefire deal that President Biden set out earlier this month in a speech that he gave Friday night after Shabbat had begun in Israel. And there's some question about whether this is the Israeli proposal or not. So let's just break it down very quickly. I already did this. You should watch last week's show where I broke down the entire deal. And I just want to center on one thing, which is it's a three-phase deal. But phase one is a temporary ceasefire for around 6 months that Israel will agree to, during the course of which it's supposed to get 33 live hostages back in, the humanitarian category. Right now, of the 116 hostages that remain in Gaza, Israel assesses that 41 of them are dead, and among the rest of them, the rest of them are assessed right now to be alive. Okay, so we're talking about far more than 32 hostages that Israel assesses to be alive. At any rate, the deal that Biden proposed had a question about what would happen at the end of the 6 weeks. Will Israel reinstate the fighting if Hamas hasn't agreed to let out the rest of the hostages, and Israel says we're sticking to our war goals, which are the release of all of the hostages Hamas defeated as a military and political entity in Gaza, and the prevention of Gaza ever fomenting or ever constituting a threat to Israeli security in the future. So Israel says these remain our war goals, and Israel views phase one as a way to get some hostages out in exchange for a limited ceasefire, the way that we did in the hostage for ceasefire deal that we agreed to in November. That got us, I think, 105 hostages or 110 hostages home at a very limited price, and that's what Israel's willing to do now. If we agree to something during those 6 weeks of ceasefire that will enable us to continue it on for another phase while we get more hostages, fine. But that's not how Hamas views this, and frankly, I'm not clear that what the United States' position on it, although my sense is that the American position is Hamas's position. Hamas's position on this is no. It's what it's been since October 7th, which is that we won't agree to any hostage deal that doesn't involve us remaining in power, armed, capable of rearming completely, and attacking Israel over and over and over again. That's what Hamas meant. So that they say that phase one is actually phase three. There's only one phase of this deal, and that is total Israeli capitulation agreement by Israel to completely capitulate to Hamas at the outset of phase one already, and no reinstatement of military operations by Israel at any time in the future. And in exchange, they're willing in phase one, which only exists for this purpose, to give Israel 32 hostages in the first 6 weeks of this permanent ceasefire. And that is the United States' position as well. They refer to it as a durable ceasefire, meaning permanent. And the Americans also are saying, well, we'll decide whether Hamas is abiding by its side of the bargain or not. We, together with Hamas's state sponsors, Qatar, and at this point, Egypt as well. And we're going to decide also if Israel is abiding by its side of the ceasefire. So Israel and Hamas are sort of the protectorates of all of the big countries, the real countries like Qatar, right? And Iran, obviously. And they get to decide whether Israel and Hamas are keeping their side of the bargain or not. And since they all want to end the war, Biden is desperate to end the war as quickly as possible. We know that they're actually on Hamas's side because Hamas has said we're only going to stop fighting if Israel capitulates, and the United States thinks that it can squeeze Israel into a capitulation. So that's where we are with Hamas and the ceasefire. And just an added little wrinkle to that is that I think at the start of the week, we also got word that the United States is carrying on independent negotiations with Hamas to secure the release of the 5 Israeli-American citizens that Hamas is holding hostage in Gaza, so that the United States is carrying out an independent negotiation with Hamas. And we know, from the outset what that means. It means, A, that the United States is negotiating on Israel's back, because obviously any concession that the United States gives is going to empower Hamas. And since Hamas is fighting Israel, it means that Israel is going to pay the price for it. It also means that the United States isn't respecting Israel as a combatant and is undermining its negotiating position by carrying out independent negotiations with Hamas. And finally, it means that if Israel has already been diminished to the state of like Hamas's counterpart and not Egypt or Qatar, or God forbid, Iran's counterpart, and now we're at the level of an illegal terrorist organization that committed the greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, that the United States is diminishing us still further because it views Hamas as an independent actor that is worthy of American attention specifically, and that the United States intends to dictate whatever the outcome of those negotiations it has to Israel, which is even less than Hamas, for the purpose of U.S. negotiations with Hamas. So that's the other aspect of it. How does Hamas look at this? So the Wall Street Journal had a significant article the other day where I think it came out on Tuesday, where it talked about how Sinwar views the ceasefire deal, the war itself, how it's going. on the basis of communications that Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas terror master on the ground in Gaza, the architect of the October 7th slaughters, and the man who continues to micromanage Hamas's operations. He's Israel's target number one, of course, but Israel hasn't located him yet. So he continues to micromanage the war in Gaza and to oversee all of Hamas's operations in Gaza, and also through some of the communications, some of which the Wall Street Journal reported on earlier this week with Hamas's leaders abroad, that all obey whatever it is that he tells them to do. So Sinwar, in this article, there were two sort of types of communications on his part that were significant. The first one is the fact that he said that civilian deaths in Gaza advance Hamas's goals, because the more civilians that are killed, the worse Israel is demonized internationally. He sees the international demonization of Israel, whether it's on college campuses, at the UN, at the ICC, at the State Department, wherever, and he sees that Israel is now on a level, like the U.S. is showing, lower than Hamas, and he believes that, therefore, the more civilians in Gaza who are killed, the better, and it doesn't matter whether the number is, 50 or, 1 million. From his perspective, whatever it is, it advances his annihilationist goal, which is directed towards Israel, and the number of Palestinians that die on the road to achieving the annihilation of Israel, the number doesn't matter, because they're dying in the service of a lofty goal of annihilating the Jewish people and the Jewish state. And so from his perspective, the civilian death toll should be higher, because the more civilians who are killed, the more U.S. pressure, the more international pressure is brought to bear on Israel to capitulate. And we see that he's right. That's true. And then he made another statement that's very important, which I'm going to get to in a second, where he talked about the Battle of Karbala, which is an historically significant battle in the history of Islam. It's the formative battle of Shiite Islam. It was carried out significantly on October 10th, very close to October 7th, in the year 680. So we're going to get to that in a second. But when we look at then in a separate article in the Wall Street Journal and also the New York Post, I think covered it, they talked about how Sinwar responded after the UN Security Council passed the U.S. Ceasefire for a couple of hostages deal. And so Hamas supposedly was going to accept this deal, right, because it was giving them a path to a permanent ceasefire through hostage release. That was the basic concept, that the United States had given them 90% of what they wanted under sort of a sympathetic pro-Israel reading of the proposal that Biden put forward 2 weeks ago, and that Hamas would cut its losses because it wants to end the killing in Gaza. As President Biden said in that speech, the Palestinians in Gaza are going through hell, and therefore they all want a ceasefire, and Sinwar is going to have to listen to his people and agree to this deal. So Sinwar said, no thanks. He said, he put it this way, he had already had his position, which again, the United States seems to have agreed to, that any ceasefire deal will lead to a permanent cessation of Israel's military operations in Gaza, a total withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. So here he says, and just to be clear, that's how Hamas defines victory. Israel leaves without defeating Hamas. Hamas remains in power. Hamas remains in charge of the international border, capable of rebuilding its forces. Obviously, you have the international community led by the United States that's chomping at the bit, dying to rebuild Gaza, because that's what they want to do more than anything else, make sure that nobody pays a price for massacring 1,200 Jews on October 7th. They all want to rebuild. They're like rushing. They're tripping over one another on their way to rebuilding Gaza. So they want to rebuild Gaza. He gets it all rebuilt for him, courtesy of U.S. taxpayers, European taxpayers, et cetera, et cetera. And he gets to remain in power and rebuild his military forces, because that's part of the humanitarian relief effort, obviously. So he said, we want a permanent ceasefire. We demand that Israel agree to it at the outset, and that will guarantee him his victory. He said that also in his communications that they cited in the Tuesday article in the Wall Street Journal. But then he added a couple more demands. Since he sees that the United States is already on his side, he might as well just add more demands. So one of the demands that he said is that it's not just a ceasefire, it's also letting terrorists out of jail. So, it's 30 or 50 terrorists per hostage in the humanitarian cases, 50 or 100 terrorists per hostage when you're starting to deal with the Israeli female soldiers and male soldiers that are being held captive in Gaza. And among those, a very large percentage are supposed to be mass murderers who are being held multiple life sentences in Israel. So he said in his new demands that among the Hamas terrorists that are supposed to be let out in the hostages for Israeli capitulation on all levels deal that the United States has pushed through the Security Council and is trying to push on Israel now, even further with the imprimatur of the Security Council, he's saying Israel doesn't have a right to veto anybody that Hamas demands the release of. So they demand the release of, he even said Marwan Barghouti, for instance. He's the Fatah head from the Arafat's guy, who is the architect of the suicide bombing campaign that the Palestinian Authority carried out together with Hamas and Islamic Jihad between 2000 and 2004-05. Where that killed 1,500 Israelis, most of whom were civilians, just like on October 7th. October 7th was a one-day version of that four-year Hamas, Palestinian Authority, Islamic Jihad terror campaign against Israel. And the architect of that campaign was Marwan Barghouti, and he's sitting in Israel for multiple life sentences for having been found guilty, I think, of 5 specific murders, and then the overall architecture of the campaign. So they want him out of jail. And Israel's not allowed to veto. That was one of the things. So that's one, that we don't have any right to say which terrorists remain in prison and which don't. They have total control of our prison system. That's one. Another one was, what else did he demand? Oh, he said that they're not going to release 33 Israelis alive, only 32. And 2 Israelis who walked into Gaza in 2014 and 2015 and have been held there since, either dead or alive, they're not going to be among the Israelis that are let out, which was one of Israel's demands. Nope, can't have that. So those are his new goals in addition to strategic victory, because Israel agrees from the outset to capitulate. And Israel, of course, is saying, of course, we're not going to do that. We're not going to give up the store at the outset because they have no impetus to let out hostages after the initial 32. And frankly, they don't have any reason to let out the 32 either, because why bother? They've already gotten everything and they get to keep everybody alive and dead in Gaza forever. And rather than, say no and put it aside, both Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan are trying to pretend that there's still something to negotiate. So, for instance, Jake Sullivan said Wednesday that the changes proposed by Hamas to the ceasefire proposal are minor, and the United States will work with Egypt and Qatar to bridge gaps in the proposal. He says this, quote, many of the proposed changes are minor and not unanticipated. Others differ more substantially from what was outlined in the UN Security Council resolution, but it's okay. They're still on board. They're still going to try to move forward with that. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about Karbala and then go to a little bit about how Israel might extricate itself from this vice grip. I keep using the term vice grip because if you saw my last show, maybe not, if you haven't, you could check it out, about the rescue operation where we freed 4 of the hostages. But in the last In Focus, I think I also talked about this Politico article where the United States is essentially saying, the Biden administration through its sources, the U.S. sources, saying to Politico that they want to overthrow the Netanyahu government, and that's why Gantz left the government last week, because the U.S. wants him to. But they talked about how Biden's initial response to October 7th was to embrace Israel in a bear hug, meaning to entrap us in his love, and that bear hug has been transformed into a vice grip. So I keep using the term vice grip because that's how the Americans view the way that they have Israel hemmed in. So here I want to talk about what he said, Yahya Sinwar said in his communications that were quoted by the Wall Street Journal regarding the Battle of Karbala. So here's just a quote from the article. He said, It's written, the Hamas leader likened the war with Israel today, that began with the Hamas invasion of October 7th. Of course, he likened the war to a 7th century battle in Karbala, Iraq, where the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad was controversially slain. Okay, and this is what he said. He wrote, "We have to move forward on the same path we started," meaning the annihilation of Israel, "or let it be a new Karbala." Okay. So again, this was a battle that was carried on October 10th, 680. And the fact that the proximity of October 7th, the day of the Hamas invasion, to October 10th raises some questions among Shiite scholars about, what was supposed to happen. And as we saw, and we've talked about this before, the Wall Street Journal and other publications ahead of October 7th had already been reporting in September, and I think going back to the beginning of the summer of 2023, on high-level consultations of visiting Iranian generals in Beirut with Hamas and Hezbollah leaders. Okay, so you had these consultations of coordination meetings between Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, carried out in Beirut in the months ahead of October 7th. We know that Hamas underwent training. Hamas's operatives who invaded Israel on October 7th underwent training in Lebanon, where they trained on paragliders, which of course they used to invade Israel, and also in Iran itself, that they carried out, that they have conducted many training missions in Iran, and then they go back to Hamas-controlled Gaza with the skills that they learned. So in Iran and in Lebanon. And we know that this was coordinated between the three ahead of October 7th. So there was speculation rife at the time, around October 7th, that Hamas prematurely invaded Israel, that Hamas saw the Nova Music Festival, decided it was a target that simply couldn't have been ignored, and they decided that they were going to jump the gun. There was an appointed day that they were supposed to invade Israel, and Hamas went early because they wanted to kill all the young people at Nova and brutalize the women. And by the way, over the weekend or before the holiday on Tuesday, I saw Sheryl Sandberg's screams before silence about the rape of Israel's women on October 7th. There are certain problems I have with the production, like the fact that she never mentioned that Hamas terrorists who did this are jihadists, that their goal is jihad and the annihilation of the Jewish people, and that their victims were all Jews. Like, she just, for whatever reason, ignored the most important, perhaps, basic reality of what happened on October 7th. But all the same, just as a document of what happened to our girls and our women, it's a very important watch, and you can get it on YouTube. At any rate, there was a question of why did they go on October 7th, and a sense that Hezbollah wasn't quite prepared yet, and they essentially saved Israel. The Nova Festival, as horrible as what happened to the victims of Nova was, that the very existence of that festival may have saved Israel from a coordinated invasion from the north and from the south a couple of days later. And that brings us to October 10th. So October 10th, 680 was a seminal battle in the history of Shiite Islam. And here's just, and what was notable about the Sinwar quote in the Wall Street Journal is that it was picked up immediately by Iran's regime daily, Kayan, in both their Persian and English editions, where they made a huge splash of Sinwar's statement about the Battle of Karbala in the Iranian media. They played it up big time. And it's important because the foundational myth of the Battle of Karbala, basically, they said that the idea is that the Shiite forefather, Ali, I think, lost the Battle of Karbala, but his stand there was enough to essentially ensure, centuries of battle going forward until the bad enemy was defeated or whatever. And so the idea is that if it isn't a win immediately for Hamas, this battle, It's going to ensure Israel's destruction over time because it's going to serve as a symbol like Karbala. But Karbala itself was important that he mentioned it because by doing that, he aligned Hamas fully with Iran and the Shiite crescent that, in the immortal words of King Abdullah of Jordan, that Iran has pushed out from Tehran across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and now into Gaza. So that when he talked about Karbala, Yahya Sinwar said that we are part of the Iranian axis, that's the whole purpose of using Karbala as the sort of leitmotif of the war that he's waging against the Jews, because it means that he's chosen a side that, although they're Sunni Muslims in Gaza and the Palestinians writ large are Sunni, he has now placed them as their titular leader, as the most popular leader of Palestinian society, not only in Gaza, but in Judea and Samaria. He's saying that we are with Iran. He has Iranified, if you will, the Palestinian war against Israel with that statement by talking about the Battle of Karbala as an edifying principle for Hamas going forward. And as a colleague of mine wrote on a WhatsApp group, he wrote, for the Sunnis with the Shiites, say is that every day is Ashura. That's the day that they hit each other because of Ali's martyrdom. And every place is Karbala. So Gaza is now Karbala. And that's important. Now, okay, he said, we belong to Iran. And this brings us to what the American game is. So if you remember back in 2015, when Obama basically gave up Syria to Iran and to Russia, he said that, the United States wanted to fight with Iran against ISIS in Iraq and in Syria. That is, he refused to view Iran and Iran's sponsorship of Assad, who was carrying out a genocide against Syria's Sunni population. He wanted to respect Iran's control over Bashar Assad. He would not target Bashar Assad or seek the overthrow of his regime, despite what he was doing to his own people. And the reason that Obama gave, or the justification that he gave, was that the United States had to respect Iran's equities in Syria, meaning the Assad regime. So Assad was an Iranian equity. And what people like Duran and Lee Smith and others have explained, and that I've also argued across the years, is that Iran is a colonial power. It wants to be a hegemon in the Middle East. It views itself as a hegemon. That's its goal. That's one of the goals of its nuclear weapons program, that it wants to dominate the region and either dominate or overthrow all of the Sunni regimes, starting with Saudi Arabia, moving across Bahrain and UAE, Kuwait, Egypt, or it wants them to accept Iran's control over their decision-making, their foreign policy, as Qatar has. Okay, so they want them either to partner with Iran as their subordinate, as their equity, like Bashar Assad, or they want to overthrow the regime and place in their own equities in the regions, in Arabia, in Kuwait, in Qatar, etc. In UAE, etc., and Egypt. So it wants to pacify the Arab world, and it wants to dominate the Arab world as part of a new Persian empire that is able to control all of the Persian Gulf and Middle East. That's Iran's conquest. That's its goal to advance its goal of world Islamic domination in the name of Shiite Islam. So that's Iran's strategic concept. That's its specific goal for the region. And when Obama said that you have to respect Iran's equity, Bashar Assad in Syria, and then wanted to partner with Iraq, Assad, against a common foe, which was Sunni, which was ISIS, he was saying, we're a colonial power, Iran is a colonial power, they have their equities, we have our equities. Now, what is an American equities? in the Obama frame of mind, which is shared by Biden and their team, which is the same team for Obama and for Biden, Team Obama, Biden, Blinken, etc., is Israel is a colony. Saudi Arabia is a colony. Egypt, I guess, is a colony. So we are allowed, as I said before, we're allowed to absorb, we're allowed to intercept attacks by Iran's equities, but we're not allowed to defeat them. So Israel, there's no point in talking about annexation of parts of Gaza or Lebanon, because as a strategic concept of the day after, which would involve an Israeli victory, because the United States doesn't even see Israel as a sovereign state. It's not a surprise that the United States places Israel on the same level or even below Hezbollah and Hamas, because America views Israel to itself as it views these Iranian proxies to Iran. And since it respects Iran as its equal, as its peer in the region, it diminishes Israel all of the time and rejects our right to self-defense or a right to make decisions on our own in terms of how we fight our wars. So we're not allowed to make those decisions by ourselves. We have to get America's approval, and America will never approve them because America doesn't want to anger its peer, Iran, by allowing Israel, its protectorate, to actually defeat its enemies, Iran's equities in the region, first and foremost Hezbollah, and second of all, Hamas. So, and Hamas, by saying Karbala, it's saying we're Iranian, we should get immunity, and it is, from the United States. So how does Israel break out of this? I mean, I guess the first thing that we have to ask is, what can we even do in Lebanon? So, I mean, we can do a lot of damage in Lebanon, but, with the United States now working with openly with Israel's opposition, including in the streets, to overthrow Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, hopefully by the end of the summer session, so that they can force Israel into elections before November 5th. And force us to accept a ceasefire, meaning defeat in Hamas, and giving Biden quiet or whatever until the war, until the election on November 5th. How can Israel break out of this vice grip? What can we do? And I think the answer probably lies with what we didn't do after April 13th, 14th, which is, how do we deal with Iran? Now, Iran just had its president and its foreign minister killed in a helicopter crash. And the helicopter crash, I think more than anything, showed just how rotten the regime is at its core. I mean, there was some like Twitter, oh, did Israel do it? No, Israel didn't do it. How in the hell would we do that? They did it to themselves. They're taking off in terrible weather. They have no logistical crew. They're so stupid that they put, both their president and their foreign minister in the same helicopter, in terrible weather with no sort of proper logistical support for the helicopters. And they disappear, and then it takes them, I don't know how long to even get to the crash site, because they're that bad at this. Because Iran itself, the regime, is hanging on by a thread, just that nobody threatens them, and then they get to carry out all of these wars, and instead of threatening them, the United States gives them hundreds of billions of dollars because, the United States sees them as a peer. So I think that the answer here really is for Israel to take action, whether through sabotage or through missiles attacks or whatever, on Iran's nuclear installations and Iran's regime installations and Iran's oil installations. That is, the way to break out of the vice grip is to not accept Israel's position that the United States is trying to force us into, of being a protectorate of the United States of America, which is perfectly willing to have us lose a strategic battle for our national survival, meaning they expect us to commit suicide, or at least agree to commit suicide over the next, 5 to 10 years, right? Is to not accept that position, is to say we're not a protectorate, and that our peer in this regional battle as a regional power is the regional power Iran. And we're going to go after Iran. Now, is that going to take away the threat Hezbollah poses? Well, yeah. There was an article that came out, I think, yesterday in Foreign Policy, which is very pro-Iran, which cited Iranian propaganda sources saying that Iran has fully equipped Hezbollah for war, and that rather than having 150,000 projectiles aimed at Israel, they actually have 1 million. Oh, they have 1 million, and they're all facing Israel. So they're saying Hezbollah is a strategic threat to Israel. If you take one move in the direction of defeating Hezbollah, they're going to just liquidate Israel. 1 million missiles pointing at Israel from Lebanon means, let's just take out Israel. Even, non-nuclear, it doesn't matter. It's much bigger than a nuclear assault would be. So that's what Iran is saying. So here's the question. If there's no more Iranian regime, if the regime is now facing a domestic insurrection by the Iranian people, over 80% of whom hate the regime and want to overthrow it, if Iran loses its nuclear equities inside of Iran because they've been taken out by Israeli missiles, et cetera, then, what is Hezbollah's guarantee of victory? What is Hamas's guarantee of victory? In other words, if you cut off the head of the snake, what happens to the body of the snake? Well, it thrashes around for a while. It's true. But it can't rebuild itself because it doesn't have a head anymore. So, I think at the end of the day, Israel's best move may be to just move in a direction that the United States thinks it's blocked, which is actually taking action against Iran before we even start taking action in Lebanon. And I'll just add to that, our brain dead generals who gutted our ground forces over the past 3 decades or 2 decades, since Barak's incredibly stupid move of pulling all of our forces out of South Lebanon. They've gutted our ground forces. They've canceled division after division after division. We had Merkava 3 tanks that were on their way to Germany, about to be shipped off to Germany on October 7th when Israel was forced to cancel the demented sale of our tanks to Europe, because nobody thought that this would happen. So we built up this military that was based on precision-guided missiles, precision-guided weapons, and our Air Force. And they were built this way because we thought that the one threat that we had to manage was Iran's nuclear weapons program. We didn't put together a means to defeat Hezbollah or Hamas. And we're struggling to do that in Gaza, and we don't seem ready quite to do it in Lebanon yet. So let's do the thing that we've trained for. It's there, and it's directing everything. Sinwar just told us that in the Wall Street Journal. And stop playing the sucker's game that the United States has pushed us into. The way to stop being a protector is to stop acting like one and to start acting like the regional power that we thought we were on October 6th until Biden gave us that bear hug and said, no. So we have to say yes. We have to say it now when it's no longer a bear hug, but a vice grip. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today, and I'll talk to you later, beginning of next week. Take care.